We left off at the carnival. They were just getting ready to leave because Sarah was sick and Johnny had finished his game. So, yeah, we're just kind of chilling. Waiting to see if anybody else shows up before we continue. It's fine. How many people we have, we have. And this is where, like I said, we're reading from The Dead Zone. We're going to read the entire book, and we're going to read it in sections. Let's see if I can figure out. I know there's 3 sections. Yeah, there's a lot of chapters, like 25 chapters. The way it looks, it's just going to keep going. It's not going to split up, so that'll be good. So we're still in the Wheel of Fortune. And the Wheel of Fortune is over 200 pages, and then the next section is a little over 100. And then the last section is... Let's see here. Oh, there's only 2 sections. So the second section, part 2, is a little over 100, and then we have notes from the Dead Zone that I want to read as well. I think that'll be interesting. So, here's where we left off. He glanced down at the wad of bills, and then tucked it absently into his pants pocket. She had asked him, "You got your money?" "Yeah, some of it, or all of it, I don't know." That burly guy counted it out. And we're going to continue. Sarah took a handkerchief from her purse and began rubbing her mouth with it. Drink of water, she thought. I'd sell myself for a drink of water. You ought to care, she said. It's a lot of money. Found money brings bad luck, he said darkly. One of my mother's sayings. She has 1,000,000 of them. And she's death on gambling. Died in the Old Baptist, she said, and then shuddered convulsively. You okay? He asked, concerned. The chills, she said. When we get in the car, I want the heater on full blast, and... Oh, Lord, I'm going to do it again. She turned away from him and retched up spittle with a groaning sound. She staggered. He held her gently but firmly. Can you get back to the car? Yes, I'm all right now. But her head ached, and her mouth tasted foul, and the muscles of her back and belly all felt sprung out of joint, strained and achy. They walked slowly down the midway together, scuffling through the sawdust, passing tents that had been closed up and snugged down for the night. A shadow glided up behind them, and Johnny glanced around sharply, perhaps aware of how much money he had in his pocket. It was one of the teenagers, about 15 years old. He smiled shyly at them. I hope you feel better, he said to Sarah. It's those hot dogs, I bet. You can get a bad one pretty easy. Ugh, don't talk about it, Sarah said. You need a hand getting her to the car? He asked Johnny. No, thanks, we're fine. Okay, I gotta cut out anyway. But he paused a moment longer, his shy smile widening into a grin. I love to see that guy take a beating. He trotted off into the dark. Sarah's small, white station wagon was the only car left in the dark parking lot. It crouched under a sodium light like a forlorn, forgotten pup. Johnny opened the passenger door for Sarah, and she folded herself carefully in. He slipped in behind the wheel and started it up. It'll take a few minutes for the heater, he said. Never mind, I'm hot now. He looked at her and saw sweat breaking on her face. Maybe we ought to trundle you up to the ER at Eastern Maine Medical, he said. If it's salmonella, it could be serious. No, I'm okay. I just want to go home and go to sleep. I'm going to get up just long enough tomorrow morning to call in sick at school and then go back to sleep again. Don't even bother to get up that long. I'll call you in, Sarah. She looked at him gratefully. Would you? Sure. They were headed back to the main highway now. I'm sorry I can't come back to your place with you, Sarah said. Really and truly. Not your fault. Sure it is. I ate a bad hot dog. Unlucky Sarah. I love you, Sarah, Johnny said. So it was out. It couldn't be called back. It hung between them in the moving car, waiting for someone to do something about it. She did what she could. Thank you, Johnny. They drove on in a comfortable silence. Chapter 2, Part 1. It was nearly midnight when Johnny turned the station wagon into her driveway. Sarah was dozing. Hey, he said, cutting the motor and shaking her gently. We're home. We're here. Oh, okay. She sat up and drew her coat more tightly about her. How do you feel? Better. My stomach's sore and my back hurts, but better. Johnny, you take the car back to Cleves with you. No, I better not, he said. Someone would see it parked in front of the apartment house all night. That kind of talk we don't need. But I was going to come back with you. Johnny smiled, and that would have made it worth the risk, even if we had to walk 3 blocks. Besides, I want you to have your car in case you change your mind about the emergency room. I won't. You might. Can I come in and call a cab? You sure can. They went in, and Sarah turned on the lights before being attacked by a fresh bout of the shivers. The phone's in the living room. I'm going to go lay down, cover up with a quilt. The living room was small and functional, saved from the barracks flavor only by the splashy curtains. Flowers in a psychedelic pattern and color. A series of posters along one wall. Dylan at Forest Hills, bees at Carnegie Hall. Phoebe! That's enough. Come on. Jefferson Airplane at Berkeley. The birds at Cleveland. Phoebe! That is enough. Leave the cats alone. The birds in Cleveland. Sarah lay down on the couch and pulled a quilt up to her chin. Johnny looked at her with real concern. Her face was paper white, except for the dark circles under her eyes. She looked about as sick as a person can get. Maybe I ought to spend the night here, he said, just in case something happens, like a hairline fracture at the top of my spine. She looked at him with a rueful humor. Well, whatever. The ominous rumbling in her nether regions decided her. She had fully intended to finish this night by sleeping with Johnny Smith. It wasn't going to work out that way, but that didn't mean she had to end the evening with him in attendance while she threw up. Dashed for the WC and chugged most of the bottle of Pepto-Bismol. I'll be okay, she said. It was just a bad carnival hot dog, Johnny. You could have just as easily gotten it yourself. Give me a call during your free period tomorrow. Sure? Yes, I am. Okay, kid. He picked up the phone with no further argument and called his cab. She closed her eyes, lulled and comforted by the sound of his voice. One of the things she liked most about him was that he'd always really try to do the right thing, the best thing, with no self-serving bullshit. That was good. She was too tired and feeling too low to play little social games. The deed's done, he said, hanging up. They'll have a guy over in 5 minutes. At least you've got cab fare, she said, smiling. And I plan to tip handsomely, he replied, doing a possible W.C. Fields. He came over to the couch, sat beside her, held her hand. Johnny, how did you do it? The wheel? How did you do that? It was a streak, that's all, he said, looking a little uncomfortable. Everyone has a streak once in a while, like at the racetrack or playing blackjack or just matching dimes. No, she said, huh? I don't think everybody does have a streak once in a while. It was almost uncanny. It scared me a little. Did it? Yes. Johnny sighed. Once in a while I get feelings, that's all. For as long as I can remember, since I was a little kid. And I've always been good at finding things people have lost, like that little Lisa Schu- Schumann at school. You know the girl I mean? Little, sad, mousy Lisa? She smiled. I know her. She's wandering in clouds of perplexity through my business grammar course. She lost her class ring, Johnny said, and came to me in tears about it. I asked her if she'd checked the back corners of the top shelf in her locker. Just a guess, but it was there. And you always been able to do that? He laughed and shook his head. Hardly ever. The smile slipped a little. But it was strong tonight, Sarah. I had the wheel. Stop. I had that wheel. He closed his fist softly and looked at them, not frowning. I had it right here, and it had the strangest goddamn associations for me. Stop chewing on that. Like what? Rubber, he said softly. Burning rubber and cold ice, black ice. Those things were in the back of my mind. God knows why. And a bad feeling, like to beware. She looked at him closely, saying nothing, and his face slowly cleared. But it's gone now, whatever it was. Nothing, probably. It was $500 worth of good luck, anyway, she said. Johnny laughed and nodded. He didn't talk any more, and she drowsed, glad to have him there. She came back to wakefulness when headlights from outside splashed across the wall. His cab. I'll call, he said, and kissed her face gently. You sure you don't want me to hang around? Suddenly she did, but she shook her head. Call me, she said. Period 3, he promised, and he went out the door. Johnny, she turned back. I love you, Johnny, she said, and his face lit up like a lamp. He blew a kiss. Feel better, he said, and we'll talk. She nodded, but it was 4.5 years before she talked to Johnny Smith again. Part 2. You mind if I sit up front? Johnny asked the cab driver. Nope, just don't bump your knee on the meter. It's delicate. Johnny slid his long legs under the meter with some effort and slammed the door. The cabbie, a middle-aged man with a bald head and a pouch, dropped his flag, and the cab cruised up Flag Street. Where to? Cleves Mills, Johnny said. Main Street. I'll show you where. I gotta ask you for fare and a half, the cabbie said. I don't like to, but I gotta come back empty from there. Johnny's hand closed absently over the lump of bills in his pants pocket. He tried to remember if he had ever had so much money on him at one time before. Once. He had bought a 2-year-old Chevy for $1,200. On a whim, he had asked for cash at the savings bank, just to see what all the cash looked like. It hadn't been all that wonderful, but the surprise on the car dealer's face when Johnny pumped 12 $100 bills into his hand had been wonderful to behold. But his lump of money didn't make him feel good at all. His lump didn't. Just vaguely uncomfortable, and his mother's axiom recurred to him. Found money brings bad luck. Fare and a half's okay, he told the cabbie. Just as long as we understand each other, the cabbie said more expansively. I got over so quick on account of I had a call at the riverside and nobody there would own up when I got over there. That's so? Johnny asked without much interest. Dark houses flashed by outside. He had won $500, and nothing remotely like it had ever happened to him before. That phantom smell of rubber burning, the sense of partially reliving something that had happened to him when he was very small, and that feeling of bad luck coming to balance off the good was still with him. Yeah, these drunks call, and then they change their minds, the cabbie said. Damn drunks, I hate 'em. They call and decide what the hell, they'll have a few more beers. Or they drink up the fare while they're waiting. And when I come in and yell, who wants the cab? They don't want to own up. Yeah, Johnny said. On their left, the Penobscot River flowed by, dark and oily. Then Sarah getting sick and saying she loved him on top of everything else. Probably just caught her in a weak moment. But God, if she had meant it, he had been gone on her almost since the first date. That was the luck of the evening, not beating the wheel. But it was the wheel his mind kept coming back to, worrying at it. In the dark, he could still see it revolving, and in his ears he could hear the slowing ticka, ticka, ticka of the marker bumping over the pins, like something heard in an uneasy dream. Found money brings bad luck. The cabbie turned off Route 6, now well launched into his own monologue. So I says, blow it out you know where, I mean. The kid was a smart aleck, right? I don't have to take a load of horse shit like that from anyone, including my own boy. I've been driving this cab 26 years. I've been held up 6 times. I've been in fender benders without number, although I never had a major crash, for which I thank Mary, Mother of Jesus, and Saint Christopher, and God the Father Almighty. Know what I mean? And every week, no matter how thin the week it was, I put $5 away for his college, ever since he was nothing but a pipsqueak sucking the bottle. And for what? So he can come home one fine day and tell me the President of the United States is a pig. Hot damn. The kid probably thinks I'm a pig, although he knows if he ever said it, I'd rearrange his teeth for him. So that's today's young generation for you. So I says, blow it out you know where. Yeah, Johnny said. Now woods were floating by. Parsons Bog was on the left. They were 7 miles from Cleves Mills, give or take. The meter kicked over another dime. 1 thin dime, 1/10 of a dollar. Hey, hey, hey. What's your game, might I ask? The cabbie said. I teach high school in Cleves. Oh, yeah? So you know what I mean. What the hell's wrong with these kids anyway? Well, they ate a bad hot dog called Vietnam, and it gave them ptomaine. Ptomaine. A guy named Lyndon Johnson sold it to them. So they went to this other guy, see, and they said, Jesus, mister, I'm sick as hell. And this other guy, his name was Nixon, he said, I know how to fix that. Have a few more hot dogs. And that's what's wrong, the youth of America. I don't know, Johnny said. You plan all your life and do what you can, the cabbie said. And now there was honest bewilderment in his voice. A bewilderment which could not last much longer, because the cabbie was embarked upon the last minute of his life. And Johnny, who didn't know that, felt a real pity for the man, a sympathy for his inability to understand. Come on over here, whole lot of shaking going on. Or come on over, baby, whole lot of shaking going on. You never want nothing but the best. And the kid comes home with hair down to his asshole and says the President of the United States is a pig. A pig. Shit. I don't... Look out, Johnny yelled. The cabbie had half turned to face him. His pudgy American Legionnaire's face, earnest and angry and miserable in the dash lights and in the sudden glow of oncoming headlights. Now he snapped forward again, but too late. Jesus! There were 2 cars, one on each side of the white line. They had been dragging, side by side, coming up over the hill, a Mustang and a Dodge Charger. Johnny could hear the revved-up whine of their engines. The Charger was boring straight down at them. It never tried to get out of the way, and the cabbie froze at the wheel. Gee! Johnny was barely aware of the Mustang flashing by on their left. Then the cabbie and the Charger met head-on, and Johnny felt himself being lifted up and out. There was no pain, although he was marginally aware that his thighs had connected with the taximeter hard enough to rip it out of its frame. There was the sound of smashing glass. A huge gout of flame stroked its way up into the night. Johnny's head collided with the cab's windshield and knocked it out. Reality began to go down a hole. Pain, faint and far away in his shoulders and arms, as the rest of him followed his head through the jagged windshield. He was flying into the October night. Dim, flashing thought. Am I dying? Is this going to kill me? Interior voice answering, yes, this is probably it. Flying. October stars flung across the night. Racketing boom of exploding gasoline. An orange glow. Then darkness. His trip through the void ended with a hard thump and a splash. Cold wetness as he went into Carson's bog, 25 feet from where the Charger and the cab welded together, pushed a pyre of flame into the night sky. Darkness, fading, until all that was left seemed to be a giant red and black wheel revolving in such emptiness that there may be between the stars. Try your luck. First time fluky. First time fluky. Second time lucky. Hey, hey, hey. The wheel revolved up and down, red and black. The marker ticking past the pins. And he strained to see if it was going to come up 00, house number, house spin. Everybody loses but the house. He strained to see, but the wheel was gone. There was only blackness and that universal emptiness. Negatory, good buddy, El Zilcho, cold limbo. Johnny stayed there a long, long time. Chapter 3, Part 1. At some time a little past 2 a.m. in the morning of October 30th, 1970, the telephone began to ring in the downstairs hall of a small house about 150 miles south of Cleves Mills. Herb Smith sat up in bed, disoriented, dragged halfway across the threshold of sleep, and left in its doorway groggy and disoriented. Vera's voice beside him muffled by the pillow. Phone. Yeah, he said, and swung out of bed. He was a big, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, losing his hair, now dressed in blue pajama bottoms. He went out into the upstairs hall and turned on the light. Down below, the phone shrilled away. He went down to what Vera liked to call the phone nook. It consisted of the phone and a strange little desk table that she had gotten with green stamps about 3 years ago. Herb had refused from the first to slide his 240-pound bulk into it. When he talked on the phone, he stood up. The drawer of the desk table was full of Upper Rooms, Reader's Digests, and Fate magazine. Herb reached for the phone, then let it ring again. The phone call in the middle of the night usually meant one of three things. An old friend had gotten totally shit-faced and had decided you'd be glad to hear from him even at 2 a.m. A wrong number. Bad news. Hoping for the middle choice, Herb picked up the phone. Hello? A crisp male voice said, Is this Herbert Smith resident? Is this the Herbert Smith residence? Yes. To whom am I speaking, please? I'm Herb Smith. What? Will you hold for a moment? Yes, but who? Too late. There was a faint clunk in his ear, as if the party on the other end had dropped one of his shoes. He had been put on hold. Of the many things he disliked about the telephone, bad connections, kid pranksters who wanted to know if you had Prince Albert in the can, operators who sounded like computers, and smoothies who wanted you to buy magazine subscriptions, the thing he disliked most was being on hold. It was one of those insidious things that had crept into modern life almost unnoticed over the last 10 years or so. Once upon a time, the fellow on the other end would simply have said, Hold the phone, will ya? and set it down. At least, in those days, you were able to hear faraway conversations, a barking dog, radio, a crying baby. Being on hold was a totally different proposition. The line was darkly, smoothly blank. You were nowhere. Why didn't they just say, "Will you hold on while I bury you alive for a little while?" He realized he was just a little bit scared. "Herbert?" He turned around, the phone to his ear. Vera was at the top of the stairs, in her faded brown bathrobe, hair up in curlers, some sort of cream hardened to a cast-like consistency on her cheeks and forehead. "Who is it?" I don't know yet. They got me on hold." "Hold? At 2:15 in the morning?" "Yes." "It's not Johnny, is it? Nothing's happened to Johnny?" I don't know," he said, struggling to keep his voice from rising. "Somebody calls you at 2 in the morning, puts you on hold. You count your relatives and inventory your condition. You make lists of old aunts. You tot up the ailments of grandparents, if you still have them. You wonder if the ticker of one of your friends just stopped ticking. And you try not to think that you have one son you love very much, or about how these calls always seem to come at 2 in the morning, or how all of a sudden your calves are getting stiff and heavy with tension." Vera had closed her eyes and had folded her hands in the middle of her thin bosom. Herb tried to control his irritation, restrained himself from saying, "Vera, the Bible makes the strong suggestion that you go and do that in your closet." That would earn him Vera Smith's sweet smile of unbelieving and hell-bound husbands. 2 o'clock in the morning, and on hold to boot. He didn't think he could take that particular smile. The phone clunked again, and a different male voice, an older one, said, "Hello, Mr. Smith?" "Yes, who is this?" "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, sir. Sergeant Meggs of the State Police, Orono Branch. Is it my boy? Something about my boy?" Unaware, he saged onto the seat of the phone nook. He felt weak all over. Sergeant Meggs said, "Do you have a son named John Smith, no middle initial? Is he all right? Is he okay?" Footsteps on the stairs. Vera stood beside him. For a moment, she looked calm, and then she clawed for the phone like a tigress. "What is it? What's happened to my Johnny?" Herb yanked the handset away from her, splitting one of her fingernails. Staring at her, he said, "I'm handling this." She stood looking at him, her mild, faded blue eyes wide above the hand clapped to her mouth. "Mr. Smith, are you there?" Words that seemed coated with Novocaine fell from Herbert's mouth. "I have a son named John Smith, no middle initial, yes. He lives in Cleves Mills. He's a teacher at the high school there. He's been in a car accident, Mr. Smith, because his condition is extremely grave. I'm very sorry to have to give you this news." The voice of Meggs was cadenced, formal. "Oh, my God," Herb said. His thoughts were whirling. Once in the Army, a great, mean, blonde-haired Southern boy named Childress had beaten the crap out of him behind an Atlanta bar. Herb had felt like this then, unmanned, all his thoughts knocked into a useless, smeary sprawl. "Oh, my God," he said again. "He's dead?" Vera asked. "He's dead? Johnny's dead?" Covered the mouthpiece. "No," he said. "Not dead." "Not dead? Not dead?" she cried, and fell to her knees in the phone nook with an audible thud. "Oh, God, we most heartily thank Thee, and ask that you show your tender care and loving mercy to our son, and shelter him with your loving hand. We ask this in the name of Thy only begotten Son, Jesus, and—" "Vera, shut up!" For a moment, all three of them were silent, as if considering the world and its not-so-amusing ways. Herb, his bulk squashed into the phone nook, bench with his knees crushed up against the underside of the desk, and a bouquet of fresh flowers in his face. Vera, with her knees planted on the hallway furnace grill. The unseen Sergeant Meggs, who was in a strange auditory way witnessing this black comedy. "Mr. Smith, yes, I apologize for the ruckus. Quite understandable, Meg said. My boy, Johnny, was he driving his Volkswagen? Death traps. Death traps. Those little beetles are death traps, Vera babbled, tears streaming down her face, sliding over the smooth, hard surface of the night pack like rain on chrome. He was in a Bangor and Orono yellow cab, Meg said. I'll give you the situation as I understand it now. There were 3 vehicles involved, 2 of them driven by kids from Cleves Mills. They were dragging. They came up over what's known as Carson's Hill on Route 6, headed east. Your son was in the cab, headed west, toward Cleves. The cab and the car on the wrong side of the road collided head-on. The cab driver was killed, and so is the boy driving the other car. Your son and a passenger in the other car are at Easton Main Med. I understand both of them are listed as critical. Critical? Herb said. Critical! Critical! Vera moaned. Oh, Christ. We sound like one of those weird off-Broadway shows, Herb thought. He felt embarrassed for Vera, and for Sergeant Meggs. He must surely be hearing Vera, like some nutty Greek chorus in the background. He wondered how many conversations like this Sergeant Meggs had held in the course of his job. He decided he must have had a good many. Possibly he had already called the cab driver's wife and the dead boy's mother to pass the news. How had they reacted? And what did it matter? Wasn't it Vera's right to weep for her son? And why did a person have to think such crazy things at a time like this? Eastern Maine, Herb said. He jotted it on the pad. The drawing on the top of the pad showed a smiling telephone handset. The phone cord spelled out the words phone pal. How is he hurt? I beg your pardon, Mr. Smith? Where did he get it? Head, belly, what? Is he burned? Vera shrieked. Vera, can you please shut up? You'll have to call the hospital for that information, Meg said carefully. I'm a couple of hours from having a complete report. All right. Mr. Smith, I'm sorry to have to call you in the middle of the night with such bad news. It's bad, all right, he said. I've got to call the hospital, Sergeant Meggs. Goodbye. Good night, Mr. Smith. He hung up and stared stupidly at the phone. Just like it happens, he thought. How about that, Johnny? Vera uttered another shriek, and he saw, with some alarm, that she had grabbed her hair, rollers and all, and was pulling in. It's a judgment. A judgment on the way we live, on sin, on something. Herb, get down on your knees with me. Vera, I have to call the hospital. I don't want to be on my knee. I don't want to do it on my knees. We'll pray for him. Promise to do better. If you'd only come to church more often with me, I know. Maybe it's your cigars, drinking beer with those men after work, cursing, talking the name of the Lord God in vain, taking the name of the Lord God in vain. A judgment. It's a judgment. He put his hands on her face to stop its wild, uneasy whipping back and forth. The feel of the night cream was unpleasant, but he didn't take his hands away. He felt pity for her. For the last 10 years, his wife had been walking somewhere in the gray area between devotion to her Baptist faith and what he considered to be a mild religious mania. 5 years after Johnny was born, the doctor had found a number of benign tumors in her uterus and vaginal canal. Their removal had made it impossible for her to have another baby. 5 years later, more tumors had necessitated a radial hysterectomy. That was when it had really begun for her, a deep religious feeling, strangely coupled with other beliefs. She avidly read pamphlets on Atlantis, spaceships from heaven, races of pure Christians who might live in the bowels of the earth. She read Fate magazine almost as frequently as the Bible, often using one to illuminate the other. Vera, he said. We'll do better, she whispered, her eyes pleading with him. We'll do better and he'll live. You'll see, Vera! She fell silent, looking at him. Let's call the hospital and see just how bad it is. It really is, he said gently. All right, yes. Can you sit on the stairs there and keep perfectly quiet? I want to pray, she said childishly. You can't stop me. I don't want to, as long as you pray to yourself. Yes, to myself. All right, Herb. She went to the stairs and sat down and pulled her robe primly around her. She folded her hands and her lips began to move. Herb called the hospital. 2 hours later, they were headed north on the nearly deserted main turnpike. Herb was behind the wheel of their '66 Ford station wagon. Vera sat bolt upright in the passenger seat. Her Bible was on her lap. Part 2. The telephone woke Sarah at 9:15. She went to answer it, with half her mind still asleep in bed. Her back hurt from the vomiting she had done the night before, and the muscles in her stomach felt strained, but otherwise she felt much better. She picked up the phone, sure it would be Johnny. Hello? Hi, Sarah. It wasn't Johnny. It was Ann Stafford from school. Ann was a year older than Sarah, and in her second year of Cleves. She taught Spanish. She was a bubbly, effervescent girl, and Sarah liked her very much. But this morning she sounded subdued. How are you, Annie? It's only temporary. Probably Johnny told you. Carnival hot dogs, I guess. Oh my God, you don't know? You don't? The words were swallowed in odd, choked sounds. Sarah listened to them, frowning. Her initial puzzlement turned to deadly disquiet as she realized Anne was crying. Anne? What's wrong? It's not Johnny, is it not? There was an accident, Anne said. She was now sobbing openly. He was in a cab. There was a head-on collision. The driver of the other car was Brad Freneau. I had him in Spanish, too. He died. His girlfriend died this morning, Mary Thibault. She was in one of Johnny's classes, I heard. It's horrible, just horrible. Johnny! Sarah screamed into the phone. She was sick to her stomach again. Her hands and feet were suddenly as cold as 4 gravestones. What about Johnny? He's in critical condition, Sarah. Dave Pelson called the hospital this morning. He's not expected. Well, it's very bad. The world was going gray. Anne was still talking, but her voice was far and wee. As E. Cummings had said about the balloon man. Blocked images tumbling over and over one another. None making sense. Harney wheel, the mirror maze, Johnny's eyes, strangely violet, almost black. His dear, homely face in the harsh county fair lighting. Naked bulbs strung on electric wire. Not Johnny, she said, far and wee. You're mistaken. He's fine when he left here. And Anne's voice coming back like a fast serve, her voice so shocked and unbelieving, so affronted that such a thing should have happened to someone her own age, someone young and vital. They told Dave he'd never wake up, even if he survived the operation. They have to operate because his head was she going to say crushed? That Johnny's head had been crushed? Sarah fainted then, possibly to avoid the final, irrevocable word, that final horror. Phone spilled out of her fingers, and she sat down hard in a gray world, and then she slipped over, and the phone swung back and forth in a decreasing arc. Ann Stafford's voice coming out of it. Sarah? Sarah! Sarah! Part 3. When Sarah got to Eastern Maine Medical, it was 12:15. The nurse at the reception desk looked at her white, strained face, estimated her capacity for further truth, and told her that John Smith was still in OR. She added that Johnny's mother and father were in the waiting room. Thank you, Sarah said. She turned right instead of left, wound up in the medical closet, and had to backtrack. The waiting room was done in bright, solid colors that gashed her eyes. A few people sat around looking at tattered magazines or empty space. A gray-haired woman came in from the elevators, gave her visitor's pass to a friend, and sat down. The friend clicked away on her high heels. The rest of them went on sitting, waiting their own chance to visit a father who had had gallstones removed, A mother who had discovered a small lump under one of her breasts, a bear 3 days ago. A friend who had been struck in the chest with an invisible sledgehammer while jogging. How? The faces of the waiters were carefully made up with composure. Worry was swept under the faces like dirt under a rag. Sarah felt the unreality hovering again. Somewhere a soft bell was ringing. Crepe-soled shoes squeaked. He had been fine when he left her place. Impossible to think he was in one of those brick towers engaged in dying. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Smith at once. She groped for their first names and could not immediately find them. They were sitting together near the back of the room, and unlike the others here, they hadn't yet had time to come to terms with what had happened in their lives. Johnny's mom sat with her coat on the chair behind her and her Bible clutched in her hands. Her lips moved as she read, and Sarah remembered Johnny saying she was very religious, maybe too religious, somewhere in that great middle ground between holy rolling and snake handling, she remembered him saying. Mr. Smith, Herb, it came to her, his name is Herb, had one of the magazines on his knees, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking out the window, where New England fall burned its way toward November and winter beyond. She went over to them. Mr. and Mrs. Smith? They looked up at her, their faces tense with a dreaded blow. Mrs. Smith's hands tightened on her Bible, which was open to the book of Job, until her knuckles were white. The young woman before them was not in nurses or doctors' whites, but that made no difference to them at this point. They were waiting for the final blow. Yes, for the Smiths, Herb said quietly. I'm Sarah Brecknell. Johnny and I are good friends. Going together, I suppose you'd say. May I sit down? Johnny's girlfriend? Mrs. Smith asked in a sharp, almost accusing tone. A few of the others looked around briefly, then back at their own tattered magazines. Yes, said Johnny's girl. He never wrote that he had a lady friend, Mrs. Smith said in that sharp tone. In that same sharp tone. Move. Can we not yell, please? Sorry. Thank you. No, he never did at all. Hush, Mother, Herb said. Sit down, Mrs. Brecknell, was it? Sarah, she said gratefully, and took a chair. He never did, Mrs. Smith said sharply. My boy loved God, but just lately he maybe fell away just a bit. The judgment of the Lord God is sudden, you know. That's what makes backsliding so dangerous. You know not the day nor the hour. Hush, Herb said. People were looking around again. He fixed his wife with a stern glance. She looked down defiantly for a moment, but her gaze didn't waver. Hi, Mom. Hi. Vera dropped her eyes. She had closed the Bible, but her fingers fiddled restlessly along the pages, as if longing to get back to the colossal demolition derby of Job's life. Enough bad luck to put her own and her son's in some sort of bitter perspective. I was with him last night, Sarah said. And that made the woman look up again accusingly. At that moment, Sarah remembered the biblical connotation of being with someone and felt herself beginning to blush. It was as if the woman could read her thoughts. We went to the county fair. Places of sin and evil, Vera said clearly. I'll tell you one last time. Hush, Vera, Herb said grimly, and clamped one of his hands over one of his wife's. I mean it now. This seems like a nice girl here, and I won't have you digging at her, understand? Sinful places, Vera repeated stubbornly. Will you hush? Let me go. I want to read my Bible. He let her go. Sarah felt confused embarrassment. Vera opened her Bible and began to read it again, lips moving. Vera's very upset, Herb said. We're both upset. You are too, from the look of you. Yes. Can you help me find the pieces to these? When I'm done. And probably when I get back from Daddy. Okay, Did you and Johnny have a good time last night? He asked. At your fair? Yes, she said. The lie and truth of that simple word all mixed up in her mind. Yes, we did, until, well, I ate a bad hot dog or something. We had my car and Johnny drove me home to my place in Vizzy. I was pretty sick to my stomach. He called a cab. He said he'd call me in sick at school today.
Well, I'm
That's
just
the
going to
last time
text you a reminder.
And
Okay?
I told you after. But thank you. And that's the last time I saw him. The tears started to come then, and she didn't want to cry in front of them, particularly not in front of Vera Smith. There was no way to stop it. She fumbled a Kleenex out of her purse and held it to her face. There now, Herb said, and put an arm around her. There now, she cried, and it seemed to her in some unclear way that he felt better for having someone to comfort. His wife had found her own dark brand of comfort in Job's story, and it didn't include him. A few people turned around to gawk. Through the prisms of her tears, they seemed like a crowd. She had a better knowledge of what they were thinking. Better her than me. Better all three of them than me or mine. Guy must be dying. Guy must have gotten his head crushed for her to cry like that. Only a matter of time before some doctor comes down and takes them to a private room to tell them that. Somehow she choked off the tears and got a hold of herself. Mrs. Smith sat bolt upright, as if startled out of a nightmare, noticing neither Sarah's tears nor her husband's effort to comfort her. She read her Bible. Please, Sarah said, how bad is it? Can we hope? Before Herb could answer, Vera spoke up. Her voice was a dry bolt of certified doom. There's hope in God, Missy. Sarah saw the apprehensive flicker in Herb's eyes and thought, he thinks it's driven her crazy, and maybe it has. Part 4. What chapter? Are we on chapter 2? Oh, we're on chapter 3. Okay. So that way I can put it in the description. A long afternoon, stretching into evening. Sometime after 2 p.m., when the schools began to let out, a number of Johnny's students began to come in, wearing fatigue coats and strange hats and washed-out jeans. Sarah didn't see many of the kids she thought of as the button-down crowd, upward-bound, college-oriented kids, clear of eye and brow. Most of the kids who bothered to come in were the freaks and long hairs. A few came over and asked Sarah in quiet tones what she knew about Mr. Smith's condition. She could only shake her head and say she had heard nothing. But one of the girls, Dawn Edwards, who had a crush on Johnny, read the depths of Sarah's fear in her face. She burst into tears. A nurse came and asked her to leave. I'm sure she'll be all right, Sarah said. She put a protective arm around Dawn's shoulders. Just give her a minute or two. No, I don't want to stay, Dawn said, and left in a hurry, knocking one of the hard plastic contour chairs over with a clatter. A few moments later, Sarah saw a girl sitting out on the steps in the cold, late October sunshine, with her head on her knees. Vera read her Bible. By 5 o'clock, most of the students had left. Dawn had also left. Sarah had not seen her go. At 7 p.m., a young man with Dr. Strawn's pinned askew on the lapel of his white coat came into the waiting room, glanced around, and walked toward them. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, he asked. Herb took a deep breath. Yes, we are. Vera shut her Bible with a snap. Would you come with me, please? That's it, Sarah thought. The walk down the small private room with the news, and then the news. Whatever the news is, she would wait. When they came back, Herb would tell her what she needed to know. He was a kind man. Have you news of my son? Vera asked, in that same clear, strong, and nearly hysterical voice. Yes, Dr. Strawn glanced at Sarah. Are you family, ma'am? No, Sarah said. A friend. A close friend, Herb said. A warm, strong hand closed above her elbow, just as another had closed around Vera's upper arm. He helped them both to their feet. We'll all go together, if you don't mind. Not at all. He led them past the elevator bank and down the hallway to an office with conference room on the door. He let them in and turned on the overhead fluorescent lights. The room was furnished with a long table and a dozen office chairs. Dr. Strauns closed the door, lit a cigarette, and dropped the burned match into one of the ashtrays that marched up and down the table. "This is difficult," he said, as if to himself. "This is a time when you could smoke in hospitals, and then towards the 80s and 90s, they started really making it to where you couldn't smoke in public, but you used to be able to smoke wherever you wanted." "Then you had best just say it out," Vera said. "Yes, perhaps I'd better." It was not her place to ask, but Sarah could not help it. "Is he dead? Please don't say he's dead." "He's in a coma." Strawn sat down and dragged deeply on his cigarette. "Mr. Smith has sustained serious head injuries and an undetermined amount of brain damage. You may have heard the phrase subdural hematoma on one or the other of the doctor's shows. Mr. Smith has suffered a very grave subdural hematoma, which is localized cranial bleeding. A long operation was necessary to relieve the pressure and also to remove bone splinters from his brain." Herb sat down heavily, his face doughy and stunned. Sarah noticed his blunt, scarred hands and remembered Johnny telling her his father was a carpenter. "But God has spared him," Vera said. I knew he would. I prayed for a sign. Praise God Most High. All ye here below, praise his name." "Vera!" Herb said, with no force. "In a coma?" Sarah repeated. She tried to fit the information into some sort of emotional frame and found it wouldn't go. That Johnny wasn't dead, that he had come through the serious and dangerous operation on his brain, those things should have renewed her hope, but they didn't. She didn't like the word coma. It had a sinister, stealthy sound. Wasn't it Latin for sleep of death? "What's ahead for him?" Herb asked. "No one can really answer that now," Strauns said. He began to play with his cigarette, tapping it nervously over the ashtray. Sarah had a feeling he was answering Herb's question literally, while completely avoiding the question Herb had really asked. "He's on life support equipment, of course." "But you must know something about his chance," Sarah said. "You must know," she gestured helplessly with her hands and then let them drop to her sides. "He may come out of it in 48 hours, or a week, or a month. He may never come out of it. And there's a strong possibility that he may die. I must tell you frankly, that's the most likely. His injuries, grave." "God wants him to live," Vera said. "I know it." Herb had put his face into his hands and was scrubbing it slowly. Mr. Strauns looked at Vera uncomfortably. "I only want you to be prepared for any eventuality. Would you rate his chances of coming out of it?" Herb asked. Dr. Strauns hesitated, puffed nervously on his cigarette. "No, I can't do that," he said finally. Part 5. The three of them waited another hour and then left. It was dark. A cold and gusty wind had come up, and it whistled across the big parking lot. Sarah's long hair streamed out behind her. Later, when she got home, she would find a crisp yellow oak leaf caught in it. Overhead, the moon rode the sky. Excuse me, a cold sailor of the night. Sarah pressed the scrap of paper into Herb's hand. Written on it was her address and phone number. "Would you call me if you hear anything at all?" "Yes, of course." He bent suddenly and kissed her cheek, and Sarah held his shoulder for a moment in the blowing dark. "I'm very sorry if I was stiff with you earlier, dear," Vera said, and her voice was surprisingly gentle. "I was upset." "Of course you were," Sarah said. "I thought my boy might die. But I've prayed. I've spoken to God about it. As the song says, 'Are we weak and heavy laden, cumbered with the load of care? We must never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer.'" "Vera, we ought to go along," Herb said. "We ought to get some sleep and see how things look But now I've heard from my God," Vera said, looking dreamily up at the moon. "Johnny isn't going to die. It isn't in God's plan for Johnny to die. I listened, and I heard that still, small voice speaking in my heart, and I am comforted. Herb opened the car door. Come on, Vera. She looked back at Sarah and smiled. In that smile, Sarah suddenly saw Johnny's own easy, devil-may-care grin. But at the same time, she thought it was the most ghastly smile she had ever seen in her life. God has put his mark on my Johnny, Vera said, and I rejoice. Good night, Mrs. Smith, Sarah said through numb lips. Good night, Sarah, Herb said. He got in and started the car. It pulled out of its space and moved across the parking lot to State Street. And Sarah realized she hadn't asked where they were staying. She guessed they might not know themselves yet. She turned to go to her own car and paused, struck by the river that ran behind the hospital, the Penobscot. It flowed like dark silk, and the reflective moon was caught in its center. She looked up into the sky, standing alone in the parking lot now. She looked at the moon. God has put his mark on my Johnny, and I rejoice. The moon hung above her like a tawdry carnival toy, a wheel of fortune in the sky, with the odds all slugged in favor of the house, not to mention the house numbers 0 and 00. House number, you'll pay the house, hey, hey, hey. The wind blew rattling leaves around her legs. She went to her car and sat behind the wheel. She felt suddenly sure she was going to lose him. Terror and loneliness woke in her. She began to shiver. At last, she started her car and drove home. Part 6. There was a great outpouring of comfort and good wishes from the Cleves Mills student body. In the following week, Herb told her later that Johnny received better than 300 cards. Almost all of them contained a hesitant personal note saying they hoped Johnny would be well soon. Vera answered each one of them with a thank you note and a Bible verse. Sarah's discipline problem in her classes disappeared. Her previous feeling that some returning jury of class consciousness was bringing in an unfavorable verdict changed to just the opposite. Gladly, she realized the kids were viewing her as a tragic heroine, Mr. Smith's lost love. This idea struck her in the teacher's room during her free period on the Wednesday following the accident, and she went off into sudden gales of laughter that turned into a crying jag. Before she was able to get herself under control, she had frightened herself badly. Her nights were made restless with incessant dreams of Johnny. Johnny in the Halloween Jekyll and Hyde mask, Johnny standing at the Wheel of Fortune concession, while some disembodied voice chanted, "Man, I love to watch this guy get a beating," over and over. Johnny saying, "It's all right now, Sarah, everything's fine," and then coming into the room with his head gone above the eyebrows. Herb and Vera Smith spent the week in the Bangor house, and Sarah saw them every afternoon at the hospital, waiting patiently for something to happen. Nothing did. Johnny lay in the room on the intensive care ward on the 6th floor, surrounded by life support equipment, breathing with the help of a machine. Dr. Strauss had grown less hopeful. On the Friday following the accident, Herb called Sarah on the phone and told her he and Vera were going home. "She doesn't want to," he said, "but I've gotten her to see reason, I think." "Is she all right?" Sarah asked. There was a long pause, long enough to make Sarah think she had overstepped the bounds. Then Herb said, "I don't know. Or maybe I do, and I just don't want to say right out. She isn't. She's always had strong ideas about religion, and they got a lot stronger after her operation, her hysterectomy. Now they've gotten worse again. She's been talking a lot about the end of the world. She's connected Johnny's accident with the rapture somehow. Just before Armageddon, God is supposed to take all the faithful up to heaven in their actual bodies." Sarah thought of the bumper sticker she had seen somewhere. "If the rapture's today, somebody grab my steering wheel." Yes, I know the idea, she said. Well, Herb said uncomfortably, some of the groups she corresponds with, they believe that God is going to come for the faithful in flying saucers. Take them all up to heaven in flying saucers, that is. These sects have proved, at least to themselves, that heaven is somewhere out in the celestial of Orion, or constellation of Orion. No, don't ask me how they proved it. Vera could tell you. Well, Sarah, it's a little hard on me. Of course it must be. Herb's voice strengthened, but she can still distinguish between what's real and what's not. She needs time to adjust. So I told her she could face whatever's coming at home as easily as here. He paused, sounding embarrassed, and cleared his throat and went on. I've got to get back to work. I've got jobs. I've signed contracts. Sure, of course. She paused. What about insurance? I mean, this must be costing a Denver mint. It was her turn to feel embarrassed. I've talked to Mr. Pelston, your assistant principal there at Cleves Mills, Herb said. Johnny had the standard Blue Cross, but not that new major medical. The Blue Cross will cover some of it, though, and Vera and I have our savings. Sarah's heart sank. Vera and I have our savings. How long would one passbook stand up to expenses of $200 a day or more? And for what purpose in the end? So Johnny could hang on like an insensible animal, hissing brainlessly down a tube while he bankrupt his dad and mom? So his condition could drive his mother mad with unrealized hope? She felt the tears start to slip down her cheeks, and for the first time, but not the last, she found herself wishing Johnny would die and be in peace. Part of her revolted in horror at the thought, but it remained. I wish you all the best, Sarah said. I know that, Sarah. We wish you the best. Will you write? I sure will. And come see us when you can. Lionel's not so far away, he hesitated. Looks to me like Johnny had picked himself out the right girl. It was pretty serious, wasn't it? Yes, Sarah said. The tears were still coming, and the past tense was not lost on her. It was. Goodbye, honey. Goodbye, Herb. She hung up the phone, held the buttons down on the for a second or two, and then called the hospital and asked about Johnny. There had been no change. She thanked the intensive care nurse and walked aimlessly back and forth through the apartment. She thought about God sending out a fleet of flying saucers to pick up the faithful and buzz them off to Orion. It made as much sense as anything else about a God crazy enough to scramble John Smith's brains and put him in a coma. That was probably never going to end, except in an unexpected death. There was a folder of freshman compositions to correct. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down to them. If there was any one moment when Sarah Bracknell picked up the reins of her post, Johnny, life again, that was it. Chapter 4. The Killer was Slick, Part 1. He sat on a bench in the town park near the bandstand, smoking a Marlboro and humming a song from the Beatles' White Album. You don't know how lucky you are, boy, back in the USSR. He wasn't a killer yet, not really, but it had been on his mind a long time, killing had. It had been itching at him and itching at him. Not in a bad way, no. He felt quite optimistic about it. The time was right. He didn't have to worry about getting caught. He didn't have to worry about the clothespin, but he was slick. A little snow began to drift down from the sky. It was November 12th, 1970, and 160 miles northeast of this middle-sized western Maine town. John Smith's dark sleep went on and on. The killer scanned the park, town common, the tourists who came to Castle Rock, and the lakes region like to call it. But there were no tourists now. The common that was so green in the summer was now yellow, balding, and dead. It waited for winter to cover it decently. The wire mesh backstop behind the little league home plate stood in rusty overlapping diamonds, framed along against the white sky. The bandstand needed a fresh coat of paint. It was a depressing theme. Can't even talk. But the killer was not depressed. He was almost manic with joy. His toes wanted to tap, his fingers wanted to snap. There would be no shying away this time. He crushed his smoke under one boot heel and lit another immediately. He glanced at his watch, 3:02 p.m. He sat and smoked. 2 boys passed through the park, tossing a football back and forth. But they didn't see the killer because the benches were down in a dip. He supposed it was a place where the nasty fuckers came at night when the weather was warmer. He knew all about the nasty fuckers and the things they did. His mother had told him, and he had seen them. Thinking about his mother made his smile fade a little. He remembered a time when he had been 7. She had come into his room without knocking. She'd never knocked, and had caught him playing with his thing. She had just gone crazy. He had tried to tell her it was nothing bad. It had just stood up. He hadn't done anything to make it stand up. It did it all on its own. And he just sat there, boinging it back and forth. It wasn't even that much fun. It was sort of boring, but his mother had just about gone crazy. "Do you want to be one of those nasty fuckers?" She had screamed at him. He didn't even know what the word meant. Not nasty. He knew that one. But the other one. Although he had heard some of the bigger kids use it in the play yard at the Castle Rock Elementary School. "Do you want to be one of those nasty fuckers and get one of those diseases? Do you want to have pus running out of it? Do you want it to turn black? Do you want it to rot off? Huh, huh, huh?" I can just imagine the sound. She began to shake him back and forth then, and he began to blubber with fear. Even then, she was a big woman, a dominant and overbearing ocean liner of a woman. She was not the killer. He was not the killer then. He was not slick then. He was a little boy blubbering with fear, and his thing had collapsed and was trying to shrivel back into his body. She had made him wear a clothespin on it for 2 hours, so he would know how those diseases felt. Pain was excruciating, I can tell. Oh, I could just imagine. The little snow flurry had passed. He brushed the image of his mother out of his mind. Something he could do effortlessly when he was feeling good. Something he couldn't do at all when he was feeling depressed and low. His thing was standing up now. He glanced at his watch, 3:07. He dropped a cigarette half smoked. Someone was coming. He recognized her. It was Alma. Alma Fretchett, from the coffee pot across the street. Just coming off shift. He knew Alma. He had dated her up once or twice, shown her a good time, took her to Serenity Hill over in Naples. She was a good dancer. Nasty fuckers often were. He was glad it was Alma coming. She was by herself. Back in the U.S., back in the U.S., back in the USSR. "Alma!" he called and waved. She started a little, looked around and saw him. She smiled and walked over to the bench where he sat, saying hello and calling him by name. He stood up smiling. He wasn't worried about anyone coming. He was untouchable. He was Superman. "Why are you wearing that?" she asked, looking at him. "Slick, isn't it?" he said, smiling. "Well, I wouldn't exactly. You want to see something?" He asked. "On the bandstand? It's the goddamnedest thing." "What is it?" "Come and look." "All right." As simple as that, she went with him to the bandstand. If anyone had been coming, he still could have called it off, but no one came. No one passed. They had the common to themselves. The white sky brooded over them. Alma was a small girl with light blonde hair, dyed blonde hair. He was quite sure. Sluts dyed their hair. He led her up into the enclosed bandstand. Their feet made hollow dead echoes on the boards. An overturned music stand lay in one corner. There was an empty Four Roses bottle. This was the place where the nasty fuckers came, all right. What? She asked, sounding a little puzzled now, a little nervous. The killer smiled joyously and pointed to the left of the music stand. See, there, see? She followed his finger. A used condom lay on the boards like a shriveled snakeskin. Alma's face went tight, and she turned to go so quickly that she almost got by the killer. That's not very funny. He grabbed her and threw her back. Where do you think you're going? Her eyes were suddenly watchful and frightened. Let me out of here, or you'll be sorry. I don't have any time for sick jokes. It's no joke, he said. It's no joke, you nasty fucker. He was light-headed with the joy of naming her for what she was. The world. So, the world as in the earth, world as in turned. Alma broke left, heading for the low railing that surrounded the bandstand. Meaning to loop over it, the killer caught the back of her cheap cloth coat at the collar and yanked her back again. The cloth ripped with a low purring sound, and she opened her mouth to scream. He slammed his hand over her mouth, mashing her lips back against her teeth. He felt warm blood trickle over his palm. Her other hand was beating at him now, clawing for purchase. But there was no purchase. There was none because he was slick. He threw her on the board floor. His hand came off her mouth, which was now smeared with blood, and she opened her mouth to scream again. But he landed on top of her. Panting, grinning, the air was driven out of her lungs in a soundless whoosh. She could feel him now, rock hard, gigantic and throbbing, and she quit trying to scream and went on struggling. Her fingers caught and slipped. He forced her legs rudely apart and lay between them. One of her hands glanced off the bridge of his nose, making his eyes water. You nasty fucker, he whispered, and his hands closed on her throat. He began to throttle her, yanking her head up from the bandstand's board floor and then slamming it back down. Her eyes bulged. Her face went pink, then red, then a congested purple. Her struggles began to weaken. Nasty fucker, nasty fucker, nasty fucker, the killer panted hoarsely. He really was the killer now. Alma Fretchett's days of rubbing her body all over people on Serenity Hill were done now. Her eyes bugged out like the eyes of some of those crazy dolls they sold along Carnival Midways. The killer panted hoarsely. Her hands lay limp on the boards now. Her fingers had almost disappeared from sight. His fingers had almost disappeared from sight. He let go of her throat, ready to grab her again if she stirred, but she didn't. After a moment, he ripped her coat open with shaking hands and shoved the skirt of her pink waitress uniform up. The white sky looked down. The Castle Rock town common was deserted. In fact, no one found the strangled, violated corpse of Alma Fretchett until the next day. The sheriff's theory was that a drifter had done it. There was statewide newspaper headlines, and in Castle Rock there was general agreement on the sheriff's idea. Surely no hometown boy could have done such a dreadful thing. Chapter 5, Part 1. Herb and Vera Smith went back to Pownell and took up the embroidery of their days. Herb finished a house in Durham that December. Their savings did indeed melt away, as Sarah had foreseen, and they applied to the state for extraordinary disaster assistance. That aged Herb almost as much as the accident itself had done. EDA was only a fancy word of saying welfare or charity in his mind. He had spent a lifetime working hard and honestly with his hands, and had thought he would never see the day when he would have to take a state dollar. But here the day was. Vera subscribed to 3 new magazines which came through the mail at irregular intervals. All 3 were badly printed and might have been illustrated by talented children. God's saucers, the coming transformation, and God's psychic miracles. The upper room, which still came monthly, now sometimes lay unopened for as long as 3 weeks at a stretch. But she read these others to tatters. She found a great many things in them that seemed to bear upon Johnny's accident, and she read these nuggets to her tired husband at supper in the high, piercing voice that trembled with exultation. Herb found himself telling her more and more frequently to be quiet, and on occasion shouting at her to shut up, that drivel, and let him alone. When he did that, she would give him long-suffering, compassionate, and hurt glances, then slink upstairs to continue her studies. She began to correspond with these magazines and to exchange letters with the contributors and with other pen pals who had had similar experiences in their lives. Why is this not charging? Here we go. Most of her correspondences were good-hearted people like Vera herself. Will you please come bring the dogs in? Thank you. People who wanted to help and to ease the nearly insupportable burden of her pain. They sent prayers and prayer stones. They sent charms. They sent promises to include Johnny in their nightly devotions. Yet there were others who were nothing but con men and women, and Herb was alarmed by his wife's increasing inability to recognize these. There was an offer to send her a sliver of the one true cross of our Lord for just $99.98. An offer to send a vial of water drawn from the spring of Lourdes, which would almost certainly work a miracle when rubbed into Johnny's forehead. That one was 110 plus handling. Cheaper and more attractive to Vera was a continuously praying cassette tape of the 23rd Psalm in the Lord's Prayer as spoken by Southern evangelist Billy Humbart. Yes. Hi. Will you please stop doing that and go feed them?
Okay.
Thank you. But pushing them is not going to help. Played at Johnny's bedside over a period of weeks, it would almost certainly affect a marvelous recovery, according to the pamphlet. As an added blessing, for a short time only, an autographed picture of Billy Humbart himself would be included. Herb was forced to step in more and more frequently as her passion for these pseudo-religious gewgaws grew. Sometimes he surreptitiously tore up her checks and simply readjusted the checkbook balance upward. Phoebe, go eat. Go put the bowl in her.
Come on.
First,
Phoebe.
listen to me. Go put it in the crate. Then walk away. Put it in the crate and then walk away. Just do as I say.
Okay.
All right, now walk away. Phoebe, go eat.
I am walking.
Go eat. Go on. Give me 1 second. Phoebe, go eat, baby. Go on. Now, please feed Harley.
Harley.
Yep, feed Harley.
Food.
As long as you've got the food in the bowl, that's all that matters.
Yeah, but I need to get food.
I just splashed my drink up into my face. Oh my gosh. Oh, I can't believe I did that. I took a drink and it went right up my nose. All right.
Harley, food. Come on.
And simply readjust the checkbook balance upward. But when the offer specified cash and nothing but, he simply had to put his foot down. And Vera, would you leave her? She will eat when she's ready.
I hardly eat.
and put his foot down, and Vera began to draw away from him, to view him as distrust as a sinner and an unbeliever. Part 2. Sarah Bracknell kept school during her days. Her afternoons and evenings were not much different than they had been following the breakup with Dan. She was in a kind of limbo, waiting for something to happen. In Paris, the peace talks were stalled. Nixon had ordered the bombing of Hanoi continued in spite of rising domestic and foreign protests. At the press conference, he produced pictures proving conclusively that American planes were surely not bombing North Vietnamese hospitals. Hi, but I'm reading, please.
Okay.
Make yourself something to eat if you're hungry. Watch TV, play your game. Clean up the fuzz in the living room. But he went everywhere by Army helicopter. The investigation into the brutal rape murder of a Castle Rock waitress was stalled following the release of a wandering sign painter who had once spent 3 years in the Augusta State Mental Hospital. Against everyone's expectations, the sign painter's alibi had turned out to hold water. Janis Joplin was screaming the blues. Paris decreed, for the second year in a row, that hemlines would go down, but they didn't. Sarah was aware of all these things in a vague way, like voices from another room where some incomprehensible party went on and on. The first snow fell, just a dusting, then the second dusting, and 10 days before Christmas, there was a storm that closed area schools for the day, and she sat at home, looking out at the snow as it filled Flag Street. Her brief thing with Johnny, she could not even properly call it an affair, was part of another season now, and she could feel him beginning to slip away from her. It was a panicky feeling, as if a part of her was drowning in days. She read a good deal about head injuries, comas, and brain damage. None of it was very encouraging. She found out there was a girl in a small Maryland town who had been in a coma for 6 years. There had been a young man from Liverpool, England, who had been struck by a grappling hook while working on the decks and had remained in a coma for 14 years before expiring. Little by little, this brawny young dock walloper had severed his connections with the world, wasting away, losing his hair, optic nerves degenerating into oatmeal behind his closed eyes, body gradually drawing up into a fetal position as his ligaments shortened. He had reversed time, had become a fetus again, swimming in the placental waters of a coma as his brain degenerated. An autopsy following his death had shown that the folds and convolutions of his cerebrum had smoothed out, leaving the frontal and prefrontal lobes almost utterly smooth and blank. Oh, Johnny, it just isn't fair, she thought, watching the snow fall outside, filling the world up with blank whiteness, burying fallen summer in red gold autumn. It isn't fair. They should let you go to wherever there is to go to. There was a letter from Herb Smith every 10 days to 2 weeks. Vera had her pen pals and he had his. He wrote in a large, sprawling hand, using an old-fashioned fountain pen. We are both fine and well, waiting to see what will happen next, but as you must be. Yes, I have been doing some reading, and I know that you are too. And I know what you are too kind and thoughtful to say in your letter, Sarah. It looks bad. But of course we hope. I don't believe in God the way Vera does, but I do believe in him after my fashion. And I wonder why he didn't take Johnny outright, if he was going to. Is there a reason? No one knows. Well, that was weird. Huh? What are you talking about? Oh, yeah. Always. It's really stupid. Anywho. Sorry, it was my son. But I do believe in him after my fashion and wonder why he didn't take John outright if he was going to. Is there a reason? No one knows, I guess. We only hope. In another letter, I'm having to do most of the Christmas shopping this year as Vera has decided Christmas presents are a sinful custom. This is what I mean about her getting worse all the time. She's always thought that it was a holy day instead of a holiday, if you see what I mean. And if she saw me calling it Xmas instead of Christmas, I guess she'd shoot me for a hoss thief. She was always saying how we should remember it is the birthday of Jesus Christ and not Santa Claus, but she never minded the shopping before. In fact, she used to like it. Now, ragging against it is all she talks about, seems like. She gets a lot of these funny ideas from the people she writes back and forth to. Golly, I do wish she'd stop and get back to normal. But otherwise, we are fine and well, Herb. In a Christmas card that she had wept over a little, best to you from both of us this holiday season. And if you'd like to come down to spend Xmas with a couple of old fogies, the spare bedroom is made up. Pierre and I are both fine and well. Hope the new year is better for all of us. I'm sure it will be. Herb and Vera. She didn't go down to Pownell over the Christmas vacation, partly because of Vera's continued withdrawal into her own world. Her progress into the world could be read pretty accurately between the lines of Herb's letters, and partly because their mutual tie now seemed so strange and distant to her. The still figure in the Bangor hospital bed had once been seen in close up, but now she always seemed to be looking at him through the wrong end of a memory's telescope, like the balloon man. He was far and wee, so it seemed best to keep her distance. Perhaps Herb sensed it as well. His letters came less frequently as 70 became 71. In one of them, he came as close as he could to saying it was time for her to go on with her life, and closed by saying that he doubted a girl as pretty as she was lacked for dates. But she hadn't had any dates, hadn't wanted them. Jean Sadecki, the math teacher, who had once treated her like to an evening that had seemed at least 1,000 years ago, had begun asking her out indecently soon after Johnny's accident. And he was a hard man to discourage, but she believed that he was finally beginning to get the point. It should have happened sooner. Occasionally other men would ask her, and one of them, a law student named Walter Hazlitt, attracted her quite a bit. She met him at Anne Stafford's New Year's Eve party. She had meant only to make an appearance, but she had stayed quite a while, talking primarily to Hazlitt. Saying no had been surprisingly hard, but she had, because she understood the source of attraction too well. Walt Hazlitt was a tall man with an unruly shock of brown hair, and a slanted, half cynical smile. And he reminded her strongly of Johnny. That was no basis on which to get interested in a man. Early in February, she was asked out by a mechanic who worked on her car at the Mills Chevron. Again. She had almost said yes, and then backed away. The man's name was Arnie Tremont. He was tall, olive-skinned, and handsome in a smiling, predatory way. He reminded her a bit of James Brolin, second banana on that Dr. Welby program, and even more of a certain Delta to Delta named Dan. Better to wait. Wait and see if something was going to happen. But nothing did. I am going to stop there as my back is starting to hurt me. We've gone pretty good today. So we will continue again tomorrow. And I do appreciate y'all being with me. I really do. It's nice to have y'all with me like it's a little, like I said, Readers Club. So follow me if you'd like. There's a Discord if you'd like to join. Not a whole lot happens, but I try to at least give people a little heads up to when I'm going to read. It's really hectic here sometimes, so sometimes I forget that I'm working on it. So I'm usually here around 11 in the morning and try to be around 7 at night because at 9 when my husband works, I have to go pick him up and then I pick my daughter up, so there's no way to get back on. Not until late, and by then I'm ready for bed. So I try to do, decent times. But if I'm not here within half an hour of the times, it means I haven't been able to get on. Like Saturday, I wasn't on at all. I enjoyed my granddaughter's birthday that day. So if I have a headache, I won't get on. And there's really no way, I don't know if there's a way to write out like, hey, I won't make it today or whatever, but figure if I'm not here within, half an hour, check again in a couple hours. Like today, it was going to be 11. I had to go shopping, so then it was 1. So, and some of y'all join me. I always try to give it 10 minutes to see if anybody's going to come join. So, I will get this highlighted and put up, and that way, if anybody wants to listen, they can. We are between chapters 1 and 5. We did pretty good today. We got to part 3 of chapter 5, and that's pretty good. So we did a couple chapters this evening. Chapter 5 is pretty long compared to the other ones. I'm looking to see where chapter 6 is, and I ain't even made it there yet. So, yeah. We don't get to chapter 6 for another, almost 20 pages, so we did pretty good. We got through chapters 1 through 5. So I will continue that. And that way, actually, there we go. Now it's on there. So anyway, I will talk to y'all soon. I appreciate you being here with me and sitting with me and listening. I will be back again tomorrow morning. And I do hope you all have a good night. And I hope you have a good sleep. Thank y'all. I love you. Thank you very much. Follow me if you would like. It'll tell you more often when I'm going to be on. All right. Bye, y'all.